one word too sharp, and one woman who refused to flinch. Dallas, Texas, a courtroom where fear once wore a robe, and silence was the cost of survival. But that day something changed. Not with a riot, not with a protest, just a single step, echoing across marble floors, heels striking like a countdown. She didn't come to make a scene. She came to correct one. What followed was bigger than a fine, bigger than a courtroom. It was a reckoning that would ripple through walls built to never shake. Because when Jasmine Crockett stood up, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for every voice ever silenced, every sentence ever twisted, every truth ever buried under a judge's ego. And she wasn't alone for long. You're about to witness a story where justice stops being a performance and starts being a fight. A story where the gavel doesn't fall quietly, and neither do the people rising against it. So buckle in. Hit subscribe to Black Footprints, because this isn't just a courtroom drama. This is the story of how a single woman lit a fuse, and the whole system had to answer for it. At exactly 9:27 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the George L. Allen Courthouse creaked open with a sound that sliced clean through the stale silence inside. All heads turned. The rhythmic click of heels against polished tile echoed like a metronome, marking the start of something no one quite expected. Representative Jasmine Crockett had arrived, 12 minutes late. 12 minutes. Just long enough to raise eyebrows. Just long enough to trigger the wrath of a man who ruled his courtroom like a kingdom, Judge Michael Pearson. But this wasn't just any late arrival. Moments earlier, Jasmine had been on the phone with the House Oversight Committee, navigating a classified whistleblower report involving prisoner abuse at a North Texas facility. It was the kind of call you didn't send to voicemail, the kind of emergency that didn't care for clocks or courtrooms. Still, as she stepped into the lion's den, tall, calm, sharp in a dark navy blazer, none of that mattered. Not here. Not to Pearson. Known among local lawyers as the executioner in a robe, Judge Pearson was a man who feasted on control. He didn't tolerate weakness, he didn't forget offenses, and he never missed an opportunity to make a public example. His courtroom wasn't about justice, it was about dominance. Congresswoman or not, Pearson sneered from behind his gavel, eyes narrowed beneath furrowed brows. Punctuality matters in my courtroom. Jasmine adjusted her lapel and responded with quiet precision. Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for the delay. I received an urgent. He didn't let her finish. I'm not interested in your excuses. Gavel slam. Contempt of court, $500 fine. There was the strike. A slap across the face, veiled as procedure. A few gasps fluttered from the press gallery. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her spine remained straight, her expression unreadable. But inside, something shifted. This wasn't a reprimand. This was personal. The air in the courtroom thickened, static humming like a storm ready to break. Slowly, Jasmine walked to the podium, heels steady, words deliberate. Your Honor, she said, locking eyes with Pearson, I've served as both a public defender and a legislator. I am well aware of courtroom protocol. I'm also aware of how judicial discretion is often weaponized, selectively applied based on race, age, and professional status. Pearson's face twisted. Are you implying bias in this court? I'm stating a pattern of punitive overreach, she replied, calm but cutting. Canon 3B-5 of the Judicial Conduct Code addresses precisely this kind of behavior. Perhaps you're familiar with it. The room went still. You could hear the shuffle of reporters grabbing their pens faster. Even the court clerk paused mid-typing. For a moment, time froze, not because Jasmine raised her voice, but because she raised the mirror. And Pearson saw himself. This was no longer a minor traffic appearance. This wasn't about a clerical error on a city vehicle. It was a spark, struck hard against the cold steel of institutional power. And it was catching fire. Pearson tried to maintain control, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't reach for his gavel again. He didn't speak another word. Jasmine's voice had already done what no sanction could. She exposed him, and more importantly, she awakened everyone watching. As she turned to leave the podium, the cameras outside were already spinning. The headlines would catch up in hours, but the fuse had been lit. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just late to court. She was right on time for history. The courthouse lights dimmed, but the fire outside was only just beginning. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out into the Texas sun that morning, the courtroom showdown had already gone viral. A shaky clip of her calling out Judge Pearson's behavior circulated like wildfire, shared, reposted, stitched with hashtags that surged across Twitter. Hashtag justice not ego. Hashtag Pearson pitfall. Hashtag courtroom reform now. People weren't just watching, they were waking up. But Jasmine wasn't basking in the spotlight. She was already moving, strategic, deliberate. Her voice wasn't just a protest. It was a plan. "We filed a complaint today," she said as soon as she walked into her district office. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about the people he's silenced." The war room came alive. Laptops flipped open, dry erase boards filled with names, case numbers, dates. Her team, part communications machine, part legal task force, snapped into action. Alyssa, her razor-sharp communications director, fielded interview requests from CNN and MSNBC while cross-referencing Judge Pearson's most controversial rulings. Terrence, her legal researcher and former public defender, dove into court dockets with a vengeance, pulling records on Pearson's history of sentencing disparities. Within hours, patterns began to emerge. Defendants under 25, harsh sentences, no leniency. Black or Latino men, contempt charges doubled. Young female lawyers, interrupted, dismissed, reprimanded for tone. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was a map, and all roads led back to the bench at the center of Pearson's courtroom. "This is bigger than a fine," Jasmine muttered, scanning a highlighted report. "It's a culture of fear, and he's been cultivating it for decades." Outside, the media smelled blood in the water. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Activists began organizing rallies. A group of law students started circulating a petition demanding Pearson's removal. But inside Jasmine's office, it was quieter, like the eye of a storm. Every keystroke was a countdown. Every document, a piece of the fuse. And then, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She frowned. Tapped to open. "He did the same thing to me. I have a recording. You need to hear it. No name. No traceable number. Just those words, typed like a whisper in a hurricane." Jasmine's heart knocked hard against her chest. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. She knew what this meant. Someone from inside. Someone who had seen too much, stayed silent too long, and now was ready to speak. She forwarded the message to Terrence with 2 words: find them. Pearson's reign was cracking, not because of politics, but because the silence was breaking. Piece by piece, those who had once feared him were stepping into the light. The tension that had simmered in that courtroom, when Jasmine stood tall against Pearson's gavel, was no longer contained within 4 walls. It was spreading, humming through data servers, vibrating through headlines, rising like thunder behind every phone camera and protest sign. And somewhere out there, a voice waited in the dark, holding the truth, holding a recording, holding a match. The courtroom had tried to quiet Jasmine, but now the country was listening, and the storm had only just begun. The war room was quiet now. Maps of courtroom patterns lined the walls, notes covered the table, coffee cups stacked in clusters like fallen pawns. It was late, past midnight, but no one had left. Not yet. Jasmine stood by the window, the Dallas skyline casting long shadows across her face. Her blazer hung loose on the back of her chair, sleeves rolled, phone silenced. She stared out, eyes unfocused, as if looking at something that wasn't there, or perhaps something that had never left. "Elena," she said softly. Her chief of staff, Elena Martinez, looked up from her laptop. Jasmine rarely used her first name in meetings. It meant something different when she did. "Yeah," Elena asked, concern in her voice. Jasmine turned around slowly, her arms folded, not with defiance this time, but something older, heavier. "I've faced Pearson before," she said. A beat. Silence. Elena blinked. "You have." Jasmine nodded. 15 years ago. I was a public defender, fresh out of law school. Passionate. Naive as hell." She gave a humorless laugh. "I thought the law was a sword you could wield, not a wall you'd keep running into." She walked back to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat. Her voice dropped lower. I had a case. A kid named Devin Price, 18, charged with assault after a fight at school. No priors. His mom worked 2 jobs, couldn't afford bail. It was clear-cut self-defense. Witnesses. Security footage. We had it all. She paused, staring at her hands. But Pearson, he didn't care. He shut me down every time I tried to speak. Mocked my objections in front of the jury. Called me idealistic and emotional. When I challenged his ruling, he fined me for contempt. I was 25, still paying off student loans, still trying to believe in justice. Elena sat still, silent, heart-pounding. He gave Devin 6 months in juvenile detention. On record, he called it character building. Off record, he told me I should consider a career in advocacy instead. Said I'd be better suited for protest than procedure. Jasmine's jaw clenched. He humiliated me, Elena, in front of the court, in front of my client, in front of myself. She stood again, voice now steady, but burning with resolve. I left the courtroom the next week. Walked out of the only dream I'd ever known. I told myself I could fight better from Congress, that I'd work on laws instead of trying to survive them. Elena whispered, "And now you're back." Jasmine nodded. Back in the same courthouse, the same room, the same face behind the bench. But I'm not 25 anymore. I'm not scared, and I'm not alone. She walked to the center of the room, surrounded by notes, names, stories. This time, I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for every young attorney he's silenced. Every kid like Devin who didn't get a second chance. Every mother who watched her child be sentenced by ego instead of evidence. She looked around, voice rising not in anger, but in conviction. Pearson thought he ended my fight 15 years ago. He didn't know he started it. And in that moment, with the past laid bare and the present roaring to life, the circle was no longer broken. It was closing. And Jasmine Crockett was finally, fully, stepping into the fire she had once fled. Not to burn, but to light the way. They say power doesn't panic until it's threatened. And Judge Michael Pearson, for the first time in decades, was panicking. Behind the stern bench and the polished gavel was a man cornered. And like any wounded animal used to getting his way, he didn't plan on going down quietly. What had started as a single contempt charge against a sitting Congresswoman had spiraled into a firestorm, one that refused to be extinguished. But Pearson wasn't alone in the fight. He never had been. In the shadowy corridors of the state's legal elite, phones buzzed with quiet urgency. Former prosecutors, senior judges, even a handful of state legislators, men who owed favors, appointments, careers to the old guard, closed ranks. They called it preserving the integrity of the bench. But everyone knew what it really was: damage control. The old boys network was alive and twitching. Contain the fire, one judge whispered over bourbon behind a locked door. Discredit her, a political consultant muttered, tossing a folder marked Crockett onto a desk. But Jasmine Crockett was not easily shaken. She had faced down Pearson once and won the room. Now, her war room had turned into a fortress of facts, fueled by whistleblowers, clerks, and former defendants flooding her inbox with stories Pearson's gavel had once silenced. Still, no one expected what came next. It was just after midnight when the cleaning crew at Jasmine's district office noticed the side entrance ajar. A window cracked, a filing cabinet forced open. No signs of cash or equipment missing, just the investigation binders, the hard copies, the physical evidence. Gone. By 2 a.m., Jasmine was standing in the center of her office, jaw locked, hands on her hips, eyes scanning the wreckage. They didn't come for computers, Alyssa Torres, her comms director, said quietly. They came for the narrative. Jasmine didn't answer. Then Alyssa's phone lit up. An anonymous number. Just a few words, sent at 2:17 a.m. Back off before someone gets hurt. Last warning. A chill ran through the room. Everyone stopped. Even the hum of the server in the corner felt louder. Terrence, her legal researcher, stood up from behind his monitor. They think this was all we had, he said, almost amused. They have no idea. He pulled up a secured link. I mirrored everything. Case files, testimonies, internal court memos. It's all on a private server. Stored off-site. Where? Jasmine asked. Terrence gave her a tight smile. In the basement of your old stomping grounds. The public defender's office. Who's going to look for justice there? Jasmine let out a slow breath. Relief was a luxury, but so was strategy. And they had both, at least for now. They're scared, she finally said. Good. But beneath her steady tone, there was a ripple of something darker. Not fear, but fury. This wasn't just about Pearson anymore. It wasn't just about the courtroom. This was the system pulling its levers, reminding her who built the walls and who was allowed to knock on the doors. Except Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to knock. She had come to tear the doors off the hinges. By sunrise, the office was back online. Servers humming, files safe, and outside, protest signs were already rising like flags. Justice, not silence. We see you, Jasmine. They had tried to erase her case. But Jasmine wasn't just holding the truth. She had made it fireproof. It started with a single upload. No slick production. No news anchor voiceover. Just a girl, maybe 17, standing against a blank wall with a face that held years she hadn't lived yet. Her hoodie was faded. Her hands trembled a little. But her voice was a blade. My name is Kayla Morgan, she said, looking directly into the camera. When I was 16, I stole a bottle of painkillers from a pharmacy. She paused, swallowed hard. They were for my mom. She had stage 4 cancer, and we didn't have insurance. She was screaming in pain every night. So I did what I had to do. Her eyes didn't break from the lens. Judge Pearson sentenced me to 3 months in juvenile detention. First offense, no priors. He didn't ask about my mom. He didn't care why I did it. He just looked at me like I was garbage. And then she said the line that would ricochet through Texas and beyond. He looked at me like I was trash, like I didn't deserve to be human. There were no violins swelling behind her, no dramatic cuts, just silence and truth. Within hours, the video had hit 1 million views. Activists reposted it. Legal blogs dissected every word. A prominent news network ran the headline. Teen story exposes dark side of Texas judge. Even late-night hosts picked it up. But for Jasmine Crockett, the moment the clip mattered most was not online, but in the hearing room 2 days later. The chamber was packed. Reporters, attorneys, community leaders, and members of the public who'd waited hours just to witness what came next. Pearson sat at the respondents' table, flanked by lawyers in expensive suits. He looked tired, but unshaken, still wrapped in the illusion of authority. That was until the screen flickered on. Alyssa, Jasmine's comms director, had submitted the video as supplemental evidence. It was cued quietly, listed as Exhibit 42. But when the footage began to play, the entire room changed. Kayla's voice echoed through the room like a bell in a funeral parlor. Quiet, but undeniable. Some in the audience gasped. A woman in the third row covered her mouth. One of the panel members leaned forward, eyes narrowed, as if seeing Pearson for the first time without his robe. Pearson didn't flinch at first, but by the time Kayla reached the part about her mother, how she died a week after Kayla got out, his jaw clenched. Not from guilt, from fear. The kind of fear that comes when the story you've tried to suppress finds its way into light. When the video ended, the room didn't erupt. It held its breath. And then Jasmine stood. No rebuttal, she said firmly. Just truth. Pearson's lawyer objected. Irrelevant, prejudicial, emotionally manipulative. But it was too late. The truth had been seen, heard, and more importantly, it had been felt. Kayla Morgan wasn't just a witness. She was a symbol of who the system ignored, of who Pearson had crushed beneath the weight of unchecked power. And in 3 raw minutes, she did what motions and citations couldn't. She made the consequences human. Back in the war room that night, Jasmine stared at the replay of Kayla's face on the evening news. She changed everything, Elena whispered beside her. No, Jasmine replied, her voice low but steady. She reminded everyone what this fight is really for. Not power, not revenge, but dignity. For every voice once called trash, now rising like truth. No cameras, no entourage, no press lurking near the courthouse steps. When Jasmine Crockett returned to Pearson's courtroom, she came not as a congresswoman or legal firebrand, but as a silent observer. hair pulled back, dressed in plain black slacks and a beige trench coat. She slipped into the last row of the gallery like any other citizen. No name tag, no spotlight, just a notepad and a purpose. The room hadn't changed. Same rigid pews, same cold air, same judge high on the bench. But something in the atmosphere was different. It was heavier now, tense, like the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. Judge Michael Pearson entered the courtroom with his usual brisk gait, robe flowing like armor. He scanned the room briefly, his eyes flicking over the spectators, but they lingered for just half a second when they reached the back row. He saw her, and it rattled him. Not enough to show, but enough to miss a beat. The first case on the docket, State versus Leon Vasquez. 22 years old, clean record, first-time charge, disorderly conduct stemming from a misunderstanding during a campus protest. His public defender stood calmly, motioning to dismiss the case based on lack of evidence and the officer's failure to appear. Pearson leaned back in his chair. Motion denied. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Leon, barely able to contain his confusion, raised his hand, politely, not defiantly. "Sir, he began." Pearson's voice cut through like a blade. "Another word and you'll find yourself in contempt." The room stilled. Jasmine's pen paused mid-sentence. Leon's attorney leaned in to whisper something urgent, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Pearson stared Leon down, his voice icy. "You know what? 30 days. County lockup. Maybe that'll teach you to respect this courtroom." Gas broke out. Someone in the gallery whispered a curse under their breath. Leon's mother, seated near the front, stifled a cry. The gavel didn't slam. It didn't need to. Pearson's words had landed harder than would ever could. In the back row, Jasmine stood up, slow, deliberate. She didn't say a word, but Elena, stationed outside, received the message instantly on her secure line. He did it again. Within seconds, it was sent to every journalist on their distribution list. The same reporters who had covered Kayla Morgan's story. The same networks that had turned Pearson's courtroom into a symbol of judicial abuse. And they were ready. Outside the courthouse, protesters were already assembling with signs that hadn't yet been raised. "Courtrooms are not kingdoms. We stand with Leon." The trap hadn't been a trick, it had been a test. And Pearson had failed it spectacularly. Back inside, Pearson barely registered the quiet ripple moving through the gallery. He didn't realize that every eye on him now wasn't filled with fear, but scrutiny. Jasmine walked out without another glance. That afternoon, the Texas Judicial Conduct Commission issued a formal statement. An emergency investigation into courtroom behavior has been authorized following new reports of punitive overreach. They didn't name him. They didn't have to. Everyone knew. Pearson had issued one contempt charge too many. And this time, the courtroom didn't echo with silence. It echoed with accountability. The room looked the same. Rows of pew-like benches, marble columns lined with the patina of time, the air cold and clinical like always. But this time, something was different. Judge Michael Pearson was no longer seated above the courtroom. He wasn't behind his mighty bench, nor cloaked in the safety of his robe. He sat at the respondent's table now, his back straight, jaw clenched, flanked by two defense attorneys dressed in somber gray. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in the room saw it for what it was. Poetic justice. This was the chair where hundreds of defendants had once sat, many trembling, many alone, waiting for Pearson to hand down his judgment like a hammer on glass. Now, it was Pearson's turn to listen. The hearing room was filled to the brim. Journalists, community leaders, courthouse staff, and an army of former defendants. Jasmine sat quietly among them, not in the spotlight, yet, but still radiating presence. Her testimony would come last. But before that, others needed to speak. First to take the stand, Terrence King, a former public defender, now a seasoned civil rights lawyer. He adjusted his tie and looked straight into the eyes of the ethics panel. "I lost track of how many times Judge Pearson mocked me in front of clients," he began. "Called me a boy playing lawyer, refused to hear motions just to make a point. I watched him hand out contempt charges like parking tickets, especially if you were young, black, or dare to speak." There was no anger in his voice. Just exhaustion sharpened into resolve. Next came Dana Williams, once Pearson's courtroom clerk. She looked nervous at first, hands fidgeting in her lap. But when the lead investigator asked her to confirm the authenticity of an internal email exchange, she opened her mouth and didn't hesitate. He referred to young defendants as, and I quote, kids who need a good scare. He once told me, if they leave here angry, I did my job. The room shifted. A low murmur passed through the seats like wind brushing tall grass. Pearson's attorneys tried to object, but were quickly overruled. And then came Marissa Flores, a 29-year-old Latina defense attorney whose voice quivered at first but hardened with every word. He shut me down before I finished a sentence, she said, looking straight ahead. Denied 3 of my motions without cause. Afterward, he told a colleague I should save my dramatics for immigration court. Gasps echoed. Even the panelists stirred visibly. Finally, it was Jasmine's turn. She walked to the front without notes, without papers, without even a pen. Just her voice. When I stood before Judge Pearson, he fined me $500 and tried to strip me of dignity, she said. But I wasn't the first, and I knew I wouldn't be the last. That's why I'm here. She spoke slowly, carefully, letting the truth land with its own weight. I've spoken to defendants who were punished for asking if they could call a lawyer. I've read transcripts where Pearson berated female attorneys and silenced young black men with contempt threats. I'm not here out of personal grievance. I'm here because this courtroom has, for years, mistaken power for justice, and we let it happen. Pearson's lead attorney objected. Your Honor, relevance. The lead panelist cut him off. Sit down. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She closed with a question, not a statement. What does it say about our courts when justice is feared more than crime? The room went still. No applause. No shouting. Just the raw sound of something breaking. Finally. Not bones. Not rules. But silence. There was no dramatic gavel bang. No raised voices. No tearful gasps. When the ethics panel announced its decision, it did so with the same calm gravity Jasmine Crockett had carried since the very beginning. Effective immediately, the chairwoman declared, Judge Michael Pearson is hereby placed on indefinite suspension pending final review. But 3 days later, when the emergency audit of Pearson's courtroom was released, the truth hit harder than any sentence he had ever handed down. 42 unjustified contempt rulings. Over 30 cases where young defendants, many under 25, received sentences far beyond state recommendations. A documented pattern of bias, intimidation, and abuse of judicial discretion. The ruling was swift. Pearson was removed permanently from the bench. No fanfare, no farewell, just an empty courtroom and a legacy dismantled brick by brick. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She was working. Within weeks, she introduced the CAFE Act, Courtroom Accountability and Fairness Enforcement, a bill born not out of vengeance, but necessity. It wasn't just about Pearson. It was about every courtroom like his, tucked away in counties across the nation, where justice bent to ego and silence was mistaken for order. The bill proposed 3 key reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training for judges at state and municipal levels. An independent oversight body to monitor courtroom practices, free from internal politics. A statewide review board composed of former judges, public defenders, and everyday citizens tasked with auditing sentencing patterns and holding the judiciary to account. We audit hospitals. We audit schools. We even audit roads, Jasmine said on the House floor, voice clear, unwavering. But we do not audit justice. That ends now. The room was silent at first, but then the murmurs began. Heads nodded. Phones lit up, and the tide turned. The CFE Act passed the House with bipartisan support. Then the Senate. Then, finally, the President signed it into law beneath a banner that read, Justice should be transparent, not terrifying. Outside, reporters gathered as Jasmine stood before the cameras, flanked not by politicians, but by people, former defendants, legal interns, community activists, and Kayla Morgan, whose quiet bravery had shifted a nation. This bill isn't about fixing one judge, Jasmine said. It's about protecting every person who walks into a courtroom believing in fairness and walking out with their lives shattered. We cannot undo the past, but we can make sure it never repeats. The first courtroom placed under CAFE review was Pearson's, but it didn't stop there. By month's end, 3 more counties joined, then 5, then 12, and a model of justice, once thought impossible, began to take root. Months later, a mural appeared on the side of the Dallas Community Legal Aid Center. It showed Jasmine Crockett standing tall in front of courthouse steps. In one hand, she held the scales of justice. In the other, she held open a courtroom door. Behind her were silhouettes, young, old, black, brown, forgotten, walking through. Painted across the bottom, in bold, defiant letters. Justice isn't earned in silence. It's demanded in presence. She never asked to be the face of a movement. She only asked for fairness. But in fighting for herself, she had created something bigger. And from the ashes of one man's courtroom, a whole new system began to rise. It stood 3 stories tall, bathed in the warm glow of the Dallas sun, facing the street where buses rumbled and school kids walked home with backpacks slung low. But people didn't just pass by the wall anymore. They stopped. They stared. Some took photos. Others just stood there in silence, taking it all in like a monument, not of stone or bronze, but of fire, courage, and memory. Painted across the concrete side of the Dallas Community Legal Aid Center was a mural unlike any other in the city. At its center stood Jasmine Crockett, not in a congressional suit or courtroom heels, but in rolled-up sleeves and sneakers dusted with grit. She held in one hand a pair of scales, gleaming gold, perfectly balanced, not tilted toward wealth or power, but steady, righteous. With the other hand, she was pushing open a heavy courthouse door. Behind that door, not darkness but light. And in the light, shadows emerged. A teenage boy in a hoodie, clutching a backpack. An elderly woman with tired eyes and a cane. A Latina public defender, head held high. A young mother. A child. A man with a tattoo and calloused hands. They were walking forward, past Jasmine, through that open door, not begging for justice but stepping into it. Above them, the scales hovered like a sun. And below, scrawled in bold strokes that looked almost carved into the wall, was a single sentence. Justice isn't earned in silence. It's demanded in presence. People read it aloud without meaning to. Whispered it. Shared it. Felt it. Kayla Morgan came one day with her aunt and stood in front of the mural for nearly 20 minutes. She didn't take a selfie. She didn't speak. She just nodded once, like she knew that her story, her voice, had helped color that wall. Jasmine didn't attend the unveiling. She hadn't asked for it. The mural wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had ever sat across from a bench and felt powerless. Everyone who had walked into a courtroom alone and walked out ashamed, unheard, broken. But one evening, just after sunset, Jasmine parked across the street. No cameras, no staff, just her and the mural, glowing in the twilight like something holy. She stood quietly on the sidewalk, hands in her pockets, watching a little girl tug her mother's hand and point up at the painting. The mother whispered something Jasmine couldn't hear. The girl smiled. They kept walking. Jasmine smiled too, because justice doesn't always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes it's painted in bold colors on a brick wall, quietly reminding a city of what one voice, unafraid, unbent, can ignite. Not just a reckoning, not just a law, but a door, open, forever.